Welcome back to This Is Live, the Sunday talk show here on the Arise News channel. Now we're going to start the next segment of the program with a quote, and I quote as follows. Written from a digital humanities perspective, this book combines historical sources, maps, and a walking cartography to create new perspectives on the 19th century history of Lagos, West Africa's most populous city. Now, that's how a book of virtually the same title, written by my next guest, who is now seated in the studio, was summarized by a reviewer. Ademide Adelusi-Adeluyi, trained as both historian and computer engineer, but she teaches classes on Africa, urban history, digital storytelling, and maps at Howard University in Washington, D.C., where she's an associate professor of history. Good evening, Professor Adelusi-Adeluyi, and great to have you on This Is Live, the Sunday talk show.
Thank you, Dr. Abati. Good evening to you too. It's nice to be here.
Well, first, let me congratulate you on the publication of this book, Imagine Lagos, Mapping History, Place, and Politics in a 19th Century African City. This is a book about Lagos.
Yes.
We operate from Lagos. And Lagos is a very sensitive subject to Lagosians,
of course,
including people like you who were born and bred in Lagos before you went international. Now, this book, I've tried to go through it. It's a cartographic narrative.
Yes.
Geographical narrative of the history of Lagos between 1845 and 1872.
Yes.
And then links us to the 21st century. Well, what is history? If it's not the present, the past, the present, and the future. But how do you tell a story with maps? Because you have over 24 of maps in this country, and you say it's cartographic. And you are using maps about Lagos to tell the sociology of Lagos, people and places and politics. Tell us about this approach, this scholastic approach.
Of course. Thank you for this great question. It's very unusual, so people ask me this all the time. Usually when you think of history, you're thinking about photographs, documents, letters, oral narratives, things like that. But what I discovered in doing my history on Lagos, especially for the earlier period, is that many people, of course, do not remember the 1840s, the 1850s. There's nobody alive now that was alive then. And the thing is, even though Yoruba culture is rich with oral narratives and all kinds of things, they aren't specifically always dated. One of the things that's helpful for us as historians is maps, because maps tell us about places where people lived, how they lived, and even how they died. So even where letters may have biases or other things, maps also have their own biases. But we find evidence of all kinds of people in the maps that we have available. We can see the historical quarters of old Lagos. We can see how streets were named, where people lived. We can even see where businesses were, where people were recovered, where people were buried. There's all kinds of really fantastic information buried in the maps about Lagos. And they start to proliferate from the 1820s up until now. These maps have so much exciting information, and I read them as sources of the past.
Okay, another aspect of this, your research that you have not published, is what you call walking research.
Yes.
You know, you visited places in Lagos, Olowo, Breadfruit, and all of that. How much of that geographical past is retained today? Because Lagos has changed over time.
Of course. I mean, this to me was the most fascinating part about doing this work. As somebody who grew up in Lagos and didn't have a lot of background in Lagos history, it was always very difficult to imagine what the city looked like, which is why the book is called Imagine Lagos. Part of what I did is, as an archival historian, I spent a lot of time in archives in the United States, in the UK, and some of them in Lagos and Ibadan. But one of the things you find is that you feel very alienated from the people who make up the city over time. So one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to walk in the city and answer precisely this question that you have. Are there any traces of our past? And I started by looking for the old steam tramway that actually was here in the early 20th century. We know we have so many questions about transportation, and this is how history helps us. I wanted to trace the old path of the tramway. And so as I was walking in Lagos trying to find traces of this, we actually did, so this is where my research partners come in, people like Belo Awofeso, who is a renowned travel writer, and Leko Adedeji, who is a photographer, we walked in the city over and over again over the summer, before the pandemic, of course. That put an end to that. But what we found was fascinating. Not only did we find that the tracks were gone, but there were still traces of them in the city. But then we started to look up at the street signs, and one day we found ourselves at the intersection of Omididu and Inobere in Lagos Island. And we thought to ourselves, is this a reference to a street? Is this a reference to Sweetwater? What does this mean? And as we continued to walk around, we noticed that the street names were really fascinating. They were in Yoruba. They were of people who returned to Lagos from Brazil, from the United States. So then I realized, doing more research, that Otumba Payne named all of these streets in February 1868. And what he did was he left us a remarkable archive of the history of Lagos. If you read the book and look at the maps on the website, imaginelagos.com, what you see is there are almost 100 names that have been in use since the 1850s and 1860s. We see how these street names change over time, how they encode power, women, place, religion, Orisha worship. One of my favorites is even how the street names encode Abiku and where these children were left when they were thinking about, these ideas of them coming back to their mothers, things about Orisha worship, all kinds of things, religion, conversion, slavery, all of this is in the Lagos Island street names. And it's fascinating to walk in the city and walk through the past.
Okay, reading through the book, one of the statements I took from it, you said in 1850,
yes,
Lagos was a very difficult place to live in.
Absolutely.
You refer to it as the blight of the bugbear, something like that, yeah?
Yes.
I took that from the book. Look, in 2024, in the 21st century,
yes,
Lagos is still a very difficult place to live in.
Yes.
Why do you think we're so cursed?
I mean, there's so many reasons why. And so the idea of Lagos as the bugbear of the bites comes from the British Colonial Archive. So I'm just sort of citing that and so talk about that. I mean, Lagos is difficult for a variety of things. It's a site of opportunity. When you look at the geography, Lagos's location gives us really strategic importance that has been important since the 18th century. We're at the crossroads of the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, the lagoons, and the Ogun River. So geographically, we have an incredible site. That also brings opportunity, economic benefits, and this brings more and more people. And the more people we have, the more competition that we have, the more intense things are. So thank you for recognizing that. This idea of difficulty, it actually extends centuries back. So this is not a new phenomenon. I always talk about the people who live and died here and try to thrive in the city. This is something that you see throughout the 19th century. So it's not new, but it's because this is a zone of opportunity, geographically, economically, and culturally.
Okay, one other thing I took from the book, going through it, is your statement about indigeneity, identity, this issue about Omeko, Araeko, who owns Lagos. These were issues you tried to address, in the 5 chapters and the conclusion. Okay, that's still a very serious issue.
Absolutely.
You talked about Dosunmu's 7 land grants in 1852. Dosunmu, son of Oba Akintoye, right?
Yes.
Yeah, who took over from Kosoko.
Yes.
So why do you think we're still having issues with identity and indigeneity and ownership of land in Lagos in 2024?
Well, my expertise is mostly in the 19th century, but what I can tell you that we see is that because of the scarcity of land and how small Lagos has always been and how valuable a space it's been, there has always been tense competition. And you brought up Kosoko and Akitoye. One of the things you find actually is that from 1851, after the bombardment happened, the city was partially destroyed and people lost land then. And so part of what I do in my work is I can show you layers of the city and who lived where and the kinds of claims that people make. And we still see this. So people will always continue to make claims. But in terms of the 21st century question about indigeneity, I think it's a vexed question, as you've said, and it's not something that we can answer so easily or that I can answer so easily.
Ademide, you have not answered that question. Who owns Lagos?
Well,
from your research.
From my
you
research?
use maps, you walked around. So who do you think is the owner of Lagos?
Well, I don't have a response about the ownership, but I know who lived here and who tried to make claims to survive here.
Okay, then I ask you, why history?
Oh,
I mean, you are a history professor. You've spent so much time writing a whole book, and I'm sure you write more.
Amen.
In a country, well, you are based in the US, this is a country where nobody takes history seriously. It's an optional subject. Nobody wants to hear about people who died In the 19th century, you are talking Olowo Gbowo, Glover. I think you wrote Gulliver as Glover and all that. Who wants to hear about Gulliver in 2024? Why history? Why did you choose to read history?
Well, this is, I think, another important question. I think people without a sort of attachment to their history are people bereft. History gives us perspectives on who we are, who we were, and who we can be. You know, culture is one thing, but cultures change over time. History allows us to really engage with who we are and why our lives are the way that they are. And it also gives us potential for the future. Someone like myself who grew up without doing history in Lagos, you know, as you said, moving out of the country and being in a different space, then people ask you who you are. And if you don't know who you are, that's a very big problem. And I think a lot of my contemporaries face this problem as well. So we're trying to answer the question of, you know, who am I? What does it mean to be from Lagos? What does it mean to be a Lagosian, also with roots elsewhere in Nigeria? In answering this question, I want it to be something that's not just academic, but also something that people can talk about in general. Our history is here, it lives with us, and it should be something that we're engaged with.
Okay, what would be your recommendations to the Lagos State government and to the Nigerian government? Because the United States, where you teach and live, you know, you see very deliberate, structured, you know, iconization of history through the museums, through the spaces. This book is about spatial history.
Yes.
Yeah, so how can the Nigerian government, about the national and subnational level, leverage on, you know, spatial history to foreground history?
I mean, there are so many things. As you said, I live in Washington, D.C., and one of the things you notice walking in D.C. is every corner, every intersection, they tell you what happened there, who was there, the historical presence, and that becomes really important. So, of course, the historian in me will say we need to mark our spaces, understand places and how people lived, but at the same time, we have to make those places worth remembering. So while we're trying to preserve our legacy, we also have to take care of people in the present. Because as you said, no one can focus on history if things are particularly difficult. So in a way, I think it goes, thinking about the past and commemorating it goes in hand with enhancing the present for people. So I think it's a double-edged sword in that we know we can put up signboards, you can put up placards, but we also have to engage with those spaces and the people who live in these places still today.
Okay, you've done a book about Lagos, Imagine Lagos. Tell me about your other research interests. You've written, obviously, about other subjects. Or are you just a Lagos specialist? Well,
one of the reasons I did this book is because I believe that, and I found this in the sources, is that the 1840s and 1850s are foundational for understanding Lagos the way it is now. If you think of a place like, I talk about street names, if you go to a place like Elegbata and Lake Street, that intersection, there used to be a creek there. And the British write about in their letters, you know, a creek and a lake saved the city from being destroyed. So I think it's really important to think about water, to think about history, and really engage with the place that we are. So for me, a lot of my future work is really thinking about also water and the lagoons and the Ogun rivers I was talking about. I think it's important to understand also how people worshipped, what they believed, and how this affected the way they use space. If you look at these maps of Lagos, not only will you see geographical features, but you'll see religious sites. You see what they call fetish spaces. You see what are mosques and what are churches. So that multiplicity is still here, and there's so much work to be done. This is a very hard period to write about, but I really want to come back and return to it because I believe this is actually foundational. Somebody asked me yesterday that, and as you asked also, what are the traces that are still here? If you go to Wilmot Point or Point Wilmot in Victoria Island, you'll see that that space was named by one of the commanders on the ships that bombarded Lagos. So he was Commodore Wilmot, and he named this space, and they named so many places after the people on the ships. There's still so much history to be done. I think the earlier period is important. A lot of people focus on the 20th century, but I'm going to continue to write about the environment, people, and hopefully write more about women in particular in the mid and the late 19th century.
Okay, in chapter 4, you talked about recovering old Lagos in new Lagos. How do we recover some of the salient aspects of that old Lagos?
Okay, so first,
new Lagos.
So by walking around, I would always ask everybody who's in Lagos, you have a connection to a street, whether by business, whether by where you live, whether by the routes you take. Look around. What is the significance of where you live? You know, everybody can find out something about where they live in Lagos. And that's part of what I do in that chapter. With the land grants that you talked about, the 76 of them, even though they're only fragments, what we find are that these land grants reference all the old markers, like the race course, the old cemetery that was in Lagos Island, the breadfruit trees, all kinds of things that are still important. So there are many, many ways of recovering Lagos in the present as we are.
But land in Lagos now is a very sensitive issue.
Yes.
I mean, beyond Dosumo, a lot of people now sell land in Lagos.
Oh, of course.
Is that an issue?
It's always been an issue. When you look at the newspapers from the 1860s, especially there was the Anglo-African in 1863, they would announce land grants constantly, and there were constant conversations and disputes over who owned what. Some of these things have not survived, and these, like I said, these land grants are often in fragments, but this has always been a question. And in fact, in chapter 2, when I write about who broke Lagos, part of it is recovering. You see letters and arguments between missionaries and Lagosians and European merchants. Who is going to own this land and who should have the lagoon frontage?
December 1851 and January 1, 1852, when Lagos was ceded under Akintoye, right?
So 1861 was the session.
But 1852,
the bombardment
had taken over. Well, let me ask you.
Yes.
How are you promoting this book?
Well, I'm
Beyond
here.
appearing on television.
Well, that's a great question. So I have a number of collaborators in Lagos that I work with. So most importantly, my book is available at Kpada, Lagos, which is a new cultural center / guest house that's on Boyle Street in Lagos Island. This is run by Falayemi Brown, who's somebody who's really invested in bringing these questions of culture, history, and belonging back to Lagos. So that's one way I'm doing it. I also do a series of talks. Before I arrived, I had done some academic talks in like Basel, in the United States and other places, and I will continue to promote the book there. But I really want not just this book to be available in Lagos, but I'm also creating a more accessible version that, because I know everybody doesn't want to read all of this text.
Plus
Yes.
it's a professionally written book.
Exactly. So, I mean, this
non-academics may find
exactly.
it difficult understanding the register.
So anyone who's interested, I'm creating a more accessible version, the one that's also more visually based, so that people can actually access it and look at it, enjoy what it looks like, but also engage with the most salient aspects of our history. So that I'm hoping will be available in March. But the book is also available now.
Well, I would like to congratulate you.
Thank you
once
so much,
again,
sir. Yes.
Dr. Ademide Adelusi-Adeluyi, for
Thank you.
joining us. The last time I saw you, well, don't let us go there. But thank you for joining me on This Is Live, the Sunday Talk Show.